My name is Teddy Hickman-Maynard. I'm Assistant Professor of Black Church Studies and Acting Associate Dean for Community Life and Lifelong Learning here at the School of Theology. Thank you. On behalf of our Dean, Mary Elizabeth Moore, I welcome you to the School of Theology. Those of you who are not members of our community, most of you are members of our community, and so I welcome you to this event, Stars in the Darkness, Life After Seminary for Modern Day Prophets. I would love to say that this was all my doing, but it was not. I take no credit whatsoever. It was dreamed up and executed and planned wonderfully by two incredible student leaders who inspire me with every word they speak and every step they take. The first is the president of the Association of Black Seminarians, our brother Andrew Kimball, who is not with us tonight because he is at the airport on his way home to Los Angeles for the funeral of his grandmother, and he will be eulogizing his grandmother. So I ask that we just take a moment of silence to honor Andrew's grandmother and to bid him Godspeed. Thank you very much. The other incredible leader is here with us tonight, and she will be our moderator for our panel. Emily Ling, who is the program director of the Religion and Conflict Transformation Program, and she will be our moderator this evening. Before I ask Emily to come and lead us tonight, and thank you again to our panelists who you will hear about from Emily and hear from in just a few moments. I wanted to put this event in a little bit of context. This, of course, is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the most illustrious alumnus of this institution, and certainly a person whose legacy looms large over our whole nation and, in fact, the world. But we wanted to do more than just commemorate his legacy. We had events throughout this week that did so, but also propelled us forward to think about the implications for his legacy for our present-day struggles for justice and love in the world. We were inspired by Reverend Tracy Blackman and by Reverend Cornell Brooks in the last few days, who gave wonderful, powerful lectures and sermons that moved us to get off the mountain and to go into the trenches. But tonight's event is geared towards our students who are wondering, after being inspired and motivated and pumped up and energized to go out into the world and to do this work of prophetic ministry, how exactly do I do that? What do I do when I leave these halls? What can I do? Where can I go? How can I do this work? What does it look like to be a modern day prophet? And can I pay my bills while I do so? So we invited some friends of this institution and some alumni of this institution, and some friends of well, more than friends. One of them's very close to me. You'll meet her in a moment. But we decided to invite people who have been where you are sitting not too long ago. These folks have been through seminary and are now doing the work in the field and can talk about those kinds of questions. And to set the mood for our conversation, I just want to read a little bit from the speech that Dr. King gave on April 3rd at Mason Temple Church of God in Christ in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, the speech from which we derive the title for this evening. If I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of general and panoramic view of the whole human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight by Egypt, through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness, on toward the Promised Land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus. And I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assembled around the Parthenon as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality. But I wouldn't stop there. I would go on even to the great heyday of the Roman Empire. And I would see developments around there through various emperors and leaders, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even come up to the day of the Renaissance and get a quick picture of all that the Renaissance did for the cultural and aesthetic life of humankind, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even go by the way that the man for whom I'm named had his habitat. Yes, I would watch Martin Luther as he tacked his 95 Theses on the door at the church in Wittenberg, but I wouldn't stop there. I would come on up even to 1863 and watch a vacillating president by the name of Abraham Lincoln finally come to the conclusion that he had to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, but I would not stop there. I would even come up to the early 30s and see a man grappling with the problems of the bankruptcy of his nation and come with an eloquent cry that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But I wouldn't stop there. Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years, in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now that's a strange statement to make because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion is all around. That's a strange statement to make. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men and women in some strange way are responding. Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. King desired to be right where God had placed him, even though the world was all messed up, because he knew that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. If he were here today, I would wager he would say to the Almighty, I want to live in the first corner of the 21st century in Boston, Massachusetts, because our world indeed is still all messed up, but there are some stars in the darkness that are shining. Please welcome Emily Ling as she leads us tonight.
Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. We don't have microphones, so I'm just going to try to talk loud enough. Give me thumbs up if you need me to speak more loud. Also thankful that Dr. Teddy did the MLK reading, and that wasn't on me to try to do because that was so lovely. Thank you so much to our panelists for coming. We're excited for the conversation that we're going to have this evening, and I'm just going to give a short bio for each of you, and then we'll get to hear more about your story and journey. So first we have Reverend Dr. Ricardo Franco. He completed doctoral studies at Boston University School of Theology in 2017. As a Presbyterian pastor, he has been involved in ministry in the U.S. and Central South America for more than 2 decades. He is also a practical theologian and scholar whose research focus is in the politics of representation of U.S. Latino immigrant religious experience and practice, both in the academy and in popular public discourse. He currently is a fellow researcher with the Latino Protestant Congregations Project, and he also is the family support coordinator with the Massachusetts Adoption Resource Exchange, where he works to bridge the gap between faith-based communities and children and youth at risk in the foster care system. So thank you for being here. We have with us Erin Freeborn. She received her JD from Northeastern University School of Law with a focus in restorative justice. And she holds a Master's of Divinity from the BU School of Theology with a certificate in religion and conflict transformation. As an attorney, she helped found the Massachusetts Restorative Justice Collaborative and co-authored the 2010 study of Project Restore, which was a study of restorative justice and sexual violence commissioned by New Zealand's Ministry of Justice. And then more locally, she has worked in Laos to train over 1,400 police officers in restorative justice, and has been deeply involved in legislative reform to expand restorative justice throughout Massachusetts' criminal justice system. And she currently is the Executive Director of Communities for Restorative Justice, C4RJ, which we'll get to hear more about tonight. So thank you, Erin, for being with us. Next we have Reverend Bernadette Hickman-Maynard. She earned a Master of Education in Human Development and Psychology with a concentration in risk and prevention from Harvard Graduate School of Education, as well as a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School. She has served as a pastor and minister to several African Methodist Episcopal churches including co-pastoring Bethel AME Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut with her husband, Dr. Teddy Hickman-Maynard. And now she is currently the pastor of Bethel AME Church in Lynn, Massachusetts. She also is a community organizer, working with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, GBIO, and has served on the boards of the Council of Churches of Greater Bridgeport and Connect, which is congregations organized for a new Connecticut. Thank you for being here. We also have Reverend Manikka Bowman. She has a dual master's degree in divinity and urban policy from Columbia Theological Seminary and Georgia State University. She has been an ordained clergywoman in the African Methodist Episcopal tradition for 16 years. After completing her academic studies, she moved to Cambridge in 2006. Since arriving, she has developed a resume that spans education, affordable housing, philanthropy, food security, worker justice, and land use policy. She currently is a second-term elected official on the Cambridge School Committee, where she advocates for educational equality in a well-resourced school district. So thank you for being here. And then we also have Reverend Vernon K. Walker. He holds a master's degree in theological studies from Boston University School of Theology, also with a focus on religion and conflict transformation. He serves as an associate pastor of social action at, sorry, how did you say it? Baraka? Okay, Baraka Church in Dorchester. He also currently serves as a case manager both at the Boston Rescue Mission and Bridge Over Troubled Waters, where he helps people without a home find opportunities for employment, housing, and detox programs. Additionally, he speaks at events organized by Raise Up Massachusetts, which is a grassroots coalition of community organizations, religious groups, and labor unions committed to building an economy that works for everybody. And he also is a part of the core leadership group for the state of Massachusetts for the Poor People's Campaign, which is a national call for moral revival. So thank you all so much for being here. So to begin with, I want to hear a little bit more about your current work, and then we're going to get to how you got to do what you're doing today. So first, if you could just each, we can start with going down the line for this question. Just tell a little bit more about the work that you're currently doing, and then specifically how maybe a theological perspective informs or impacts the way that you're approaching the different projects and ministry that you're doing. So meaning, like, to the extent that what you're doing is an embodiment of how you have understood God, maybe coming out of your theological studies, how is that a reason for why you're choosing to invest your energy the way that you are currently? So yeah, we can start here. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation in this afternoon. I'm kind of battling a sore throat, so please forgive my voice. 5 years of theological education gave me the theoretical framework, the language, and the methodology to name a gap, not just in the literature of my field, which is spiritual studies, but in the sociocultural categories used to analyze religious practices in minority communities. It became clear that the invisibility of minority voices and experiences in the academy is not accidental. On the contrary, it is part of a well-orchestrated intellectual embargo by the structures and systems of knowledge production and dissemination invested on maintaining well-entrenched social and economical inequalities. Since founding for research in marginalized communities is very restricted, and so often it is conducted by white privileged people, the scholars, I have to diversify my resources and sources of income, combining a limited grant with a 9-to-5 job in a nonprofit organization. So theological reflection, prophetic ministry, and social advocacy are not in the top list of salaries scales. And for that reason, I need to be resourceful. At the same time, I would say we need to be wise, because the main strategy in these circles of power to neutralize opposing voices is to tag a salary to the person of the prophet. But not all is measured by economic terms. The building of communities is not just social capital as much as the loved community.
Thank you.
As the Executive Director at Communities for Restorative Justice, the work that I do now is centered on bringing people together. And C4RJ is a community police partnership, and after a crime occurs, the police do their investigation as if they were going to court, and at that juncture where they would send the paperwork to court, they send it to my organization. And we do the work to prepare the parties, to bring them together to determine what harm occurred, what needs were created, and what we should do to try and repair that. We work with community volunteers to conduct the work, and it is extremely rewarding work. I do have to say that I am in my dream job, that when a decade ago I was sitting down here, but it looked a lot different because they did a remodel since then. A decade ago I was sitting dreaming about a position like this, and I have to say that now that I'm here, I intend to stay here for a very long time. I like to think about myself as a social entrepreneur as well. I'm always trying to think in the nonprofit world how to think a little bit like a for-profit so that we can grow and be sustainable and thrive and do more good work. And I also see my vocation of a bridge maker. I have always throughout various parts of my life been a bridge maker between different groups of society, different types of people, and even in my role today, I am living out that vocation and certainly bringing people together, the victims and the offenders of crimes, with the police and the community members can be a really inspirational line of work. So that is the tie.
My 3-year-old son Zion asks me probably every other day as I'm leaving to go, "Why do you have to go to work, Mommy? I don't want you to go." And I come to say regularly, "Well, I want to go change the world and make some money." And so that is my response, and that's kind of how I see what I am doing now. In that order, helping to change the world and make some money, because you got to pay the bills, and he likes to eat. And so do the other 3 children that we have. And currently I am pastoring at Bethel AME Church in Lynn, Massachusetts. And while I've come to a place, we'll talk I guess later about the journey now, where I feel like I want to be pastoring full-time, and my call is very much one where I understand it to be not just leading God's people within the 4 walls of the church, but that the church of my parish is the community. And I'd like to be able to do that full-time, but I am not able to do that full-time. And so I'm also a community organizer with the Greater Boston Interfaith organization. And so I see also that work within Boston very much like a parish, if you will, as well, organizing people to build power to make change in society. I believe that God has called us all to be equal and to experience the potential and to reach the potential that God has given all of us, but that there are systems and structures in place in this world that keep us from doing that, and that we can't just talk and preach to the individuals about individual growth and flourishment, which I do, and I think is important, but it is also important that we come together and fight systems. And so because I'm not able to do that fully in the community that I would where I pastor, I'm also working with GBIO, and we've been doing work on criminal justice reform and housing, affordable housing, healthcare. But I must say that within the context of my work as pastor in Lynn, I also work with the Essex County Community Organizations, because I very much see the work of faith, my work and the work of preaching of the gospel of ministry to be beyond the four walls. Our congregation is active in Lynn and the Essex County Community Organizations. They too are involved in criminal justice reform, police reform, particularly in the city of Lynn, as well as immigration and sanctuary movements, and the fight for $15 minimum wage. So I see my work as being reflective of a God that has called all of us to experience abundance and to be free from those systems that keep us from experiencing it.
Well, when I graduated from seminary, I would not have imagined the life that I have now. Then I always knew that I had this passion and call for the intersection of the moral voice and public life. But I'll never forget my last year in seminary. I was horrified to leave because the writing was on the wall as it relates to me being a woman in a historical Black church context. I was not legacy. There are all the things that would make you privileged in that context. I was not. And so I had to have a come to Jesus with myself as it relates to the path that I wanted to take. And so it led me to where I'm at now. And so I work many jobs like everybody else on this panel. So I serve in the city of Cambridge as an elected official on the school committee, and truly see the work that I do there as that intersection of moral voice and public life. And a lot of times when people think about public office or advocacy and lobbying, it's always a battle and it's always a fight. Now that I'm on the other side of the table, I understand that you do need to push and hold people accountable, but also particularly in the context of what's happening nationally, people need civility in our local government. And particularly in my second term now, just being able to just make sure that we operate from a place of equity and respect, regardless of whether or not we agree or disagree on an issue. The process by which we get to our answers or how we pass a policy, it truly matters. And it matters now more than ever, particularly in the context of what's happening at the national level, because that stuff filters up and down. So definitely when it comes to how my faith is shaping, my life, particularly in the context of the work that I do in public life, is something I've always felt very called to, and do feel very privileged to be able to be in a space where I threw caution to the wind and I decided to run for office, and clearly see that that's the path that the Creator laid out for me.
First of all, I want to say glad to be back here at the School of the Prophets. And hello, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, friends and family. So wonderful to be back here and to be in conversation with you all. My heart is always glad anytime I can come back to a school, to a university that teaches challenging systemic social injustices that exist, and challenging racism and evil that exists in our society today. And it was this very foundation that shaped my particular outlook and led me to the work that I do now. Currently, working at the Boston Rescue Mission, which is a Christian organization, nonprofit, and working for Bridge Over Troubled Waters, particularly focusing on 18 to 24-year-old homeless folks, or folks without a home, as well as Boston Rescue Mission aim is the same, to focus on helping the marginalized, the disenfranchised, and the least of these who are in a difficult position. For me, it was developing a theological framework here that allowed me to expand my concern for my brother and my sister. Before moving to Boston, I come by way of Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, born and raised. That's where I spent most of my days. Kind of like Will Smith, right? Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But in my work in Philadelphia, grew out of my own experience with poverty, grew out of my own sense of abandonment, my own sense of going to underfunded and underprivileged schools in the Philadelphia public school system. So it was in that particular context that I began to really understand, growing up, really understand how poverty affects one holistically, emotionally, psychologically, physically. Poverty can leave a damaging effect to one's sense of oneness, to one's sense of being. So it was here. So when I arrived at the Boston University School of Theology, it was here that I began to continue to develop a theological and moral framework to begin to work with the marginalized and the disenfranchised, and the least of these. And this particularly comes out of the context of the Gospels. Scripture tells us that when Jesus began his public ministry, that he proclaimed that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, bring good news to the poor. And in my work today, brothers and sisters, I work with people who are oppressed, suppressed, depressed, oppressed, and they're tired. They're tired because they felt like their family has failed them. They felt like their partners have failed them. They felt like nonprofit organizations have failed them. And they felt, and also feel like detox programs have failed them. So as a result, the people that I experience and the people that I work with on a day-to-day level, I'm interested in helping them to not only experience stability, but to get back on the right track. Because at some point, it was a shocking moment that they find themselves homeless. And the similarity between both organizations, which allows me to operate freely with working with people, is this concern for people who are without homes, and for people who are trying to get back on the right track, who are trying to find themselves in a place of stability. And oftentimes, and we can touch on this a little bit later, but oftentimes clients that come into my office have gotten to the place where they are getting high daily, they are turning to alcohol for answers, they are turning to opiates for answers because they just feel like no one cares about them, no one loves them, no one is concerned about their moral well-being. But so for me, it's a joy when I work with someone and we are able to help find them gainful employment, help them enter into detox program, help them find inpatient or outpatient treatment programs, and ultimately help them on the road to stability.
Thank you. Yeah, y'all are doing amazing work. It's exciting even just to hear kind of the range of ways in which y'all are out there in the community. Something that we were curious to hear about from all of you is what the process of vocational discernment has kind of looked like for you, specifically coming out of seminary, and maybe some of like the first things that you did when you left school that led to where you're at today, and if there was any like particular turning point or kind of like lessons learned when you left here that got you to do what you're doing today. And we don't have to go in any order, just whoever wants to share can kind of have a conversation.
I can jump in.
Yeah.
So, as I alluded to earlier, I had to have a come to Jesus moment with myself when I left seminary, and I had to really pose some really hard questions to myself. At the time, I was not married, and it's no secret in the church that I'm ordained in, the women get sent out to the countryside, and so I had this moment of, what did I want from my life? I wanted to serve. I knew I wanted to eventually run for public office. And I had to pose this question to myself: would the denomination in its current state be able to support me with being able to live out what I felt like what my call was? Mm-hmm. And in that moment, it was a very hard decision. I realized that they wouldn't be able to do it for me. And so I had to take a step back and figure out, okay, what will I do when I leave here? Because I too grew up in public housing, single parent. I had a crap load of student loan debt, and all of that pressure was weighing on me. And so I made a decision. I didn't even have a conversation with my bishop about it. I just made the decision to go down the nonprofit route and leverage my degree in urban policy to position me to just be able to develop a diversity of skill sets, or I had the skill sets already, but be able to stack my resume in a way that I can go back and forth between whether I wanted to be in a theological world or be a part of more of a secular context as it relates to my work, and still bring the aspects of my faith in, but be very thoughtful and strategic about how I positioned myself outside of a seminary context. And it's very tricky because you get so caught up in seminary. It's this beautiful space where you get to define yourself and your theology and how you view the world, and then you go out into the world, and just to be frank, nobody cares about that stuff. Nobody. And I shouldn't say nobody, but most entities, unless you're like independently wealthy and you can just go and create whatever job you want to, that's just not how the real world works. And so it was a bit shocking that no one cared. But I had to take the beautiful aspects of what shaped me to be the person that I was, which was my seminary education, and bring that with me despite the fact that no one cared about that experience. So I carried it with me, but I had to reframe that knowledge base in a way that was compatible with the context in which I was operating in.
I feel like I have to go on the dovetailing to that one, because I came from seminary here where it was beautiful and you can be very reflective about all those elements that you were just referencing. And then I went across town to law school where they will tell you that no one cares what you think or what you feel or what you want. And you're just there to learn how to think like a lawyer. And that was also really helpful, and it helped me to start to think about how I could use this calling and vocation and mission that I was confident about and build that into a way to change the system from the inside. And that was my plan. And I can tell you that I went, so I did my field ed placement here slightly differently than a lot of people do. So a lot of people will go and work 10 hours a week at a church and be there all year long doing lots of various good work. And I did mine as a full-time summer placement. And I went and worked for the Global Board of Church and Society down on Capitol Hill in DC. And I went down there to try and understand how the Methodist Church operates to change social policy. And at that point, I still hadn't determined that my future was as an attorney, but that was one of the turning points, because while I was down there, I was able to have one of those wonderful intern jobs. I was tasked with helping someone put together a conference, and it was Tom Porter. And Tom Porter was organizing a conference for the justices in the Methodist Church about restorative justice. And that was the first time that I'd ever heard about restorative justice. And it was after my first year of schooling here. So I came back that fall, and with the BTI, it was great. I went and I took a class over at Harvard Div that was about church and society and the separation of church and state. And we read case law, and we were really reflective about why there is a separation and what the values are to that structure, yet how we can use these two to make positive social change. And then I would come back across the river and I'd sit on the BU beach, and I was sitting on the BU beach one day where I just had a reckoning that I was to go to law school. And you can imagine my parents' surprise when I called them, because you can imagine the surprise they had when their 16-year-old came back from church camp and said, "I'm gonna be a preacher." And then so you can imagine a number of years later when that then probably early 20-somethings calls and says, "I'm sitting at seminary and I'm gonna be a lawyer." And I want to do restorative justice. And you know, a lot of people's next question is, what's that? And so that was the beginning of the journey for me. And it took me across town, which took me into lots of other great opportunities. But it was really, this was the foundation. and it continues to be the core. I come back every spring and talk to Tom Porter's Restorative Justice course, and it's one of the most inspiring parts of my year. And it's really great because it always feels like coming home.
I'll go next. As I think about theological education, for me, was very liberating. And I say I went to seminary twice, because Teddy went first to BU here in School of Theology, and he would come and he would tell me about his lectures with Kathy Dart and with and Wesley Wildman, and I had my spiritual crisis first through him. And so that was my first experience with seminary. And then my second experience when I went there, I didn't have any spiritual crises because I had gone through it all with him. And so at Harvard, it was very much liberating for me, sitting in a classroom with Jews and Muslims, and it broadened my understanding of who God was, what God was doing in the world, and how I was sitting, trying to wrestle with sexism and feminism, and I could sit with, Muslim women who were wrestling with sexism and feminism, and Jewish women who were, and so my experience was truly liberating me from sort of this prison of a small God and small understanding of church and of the world. And so that was my experience on the one hand, and then I was liberated to an experience of a leash around my neck, tethered to that prison by the institution of the church. Saying, don't go too far now. Make sure, that you are still connected. We don't want to make sure that you love everybody quite so much. Everybody is really not equal. And my experience from the time of my first experience with the church, with the AME church, and I grew up in a conservative Baptist church, conservative, big C. So it was a conservative Baptist church, and it was called the Conservative Baptist Association of America, right? Very conservative. Women and men were not equal. Know your roles. So there was no way that I was going to be a preacher. I didn't really think that I would be. Believed that God called men to leadership in the church. I came here to Boston to college, met Teddy, went to the AME church, was like blown away by the fact that there were all these women preaching, and had to wrestle with the idea that God could call women and that I might be called, while he was going to seminary and I was having my first seminary experience. When I had gone through my own sort of second conversion, if you will, I've had probably 5. But when I went through my conversion and came out with a strong belief in a God who created men and women equal, and through his theological education, which then led to my own, before I went to seminary, believing that I was called to preach a liberating gospel, then experiencing in the AME church that women were second-class ministers, and wouldn't say it on the outset like my Conservative Baptist Association church would. Well, they wouldn't be ministers at all, but that the experience was, no, we don't really want you. And so at that time I said, you know what, church folk are crazy, and I'm going to preach my liberating gospel outside of the church. And so that is when I started. I decided to go to the ed school, and I majored in risk of prevention, wanted to help young people be their best selves, and then went to seminary because I felt called, but still felt like church people were crazy, and Teddy was going to be the pastor, I was going to be the social justice person, and after that I went and ran a seniors program, and I did some organizing around education, and I was like, this is my focus. And then I decided not to, because the church was the leash around my neck, and I felt very much like I could not speak, and like I could not breathe, and like I could not really be all that God would have me. I says, you know what, maybe the AME church is not for me, right? These people are crazy. And so I decided to leave and then worship with the UCCs for a year, and was very much felt at home there, but felt like I missed I miss Black people, and I felt like if everyone who was progressive and who wanted to be free and who wanted to lead others toward freedom left and freed themselves from the leash, then the Black church would be left behind, the AME church would be left behind. And so I went to a different church. I said, okay, I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna be ordained, but I'm not going to go back to the church that I was a part of. And so I went back to a different church, and then I found out that all Black AME Christians are not the same. And while I very much had an experience that some Black church folk were crazy and did not want to hear me and did not want to affirm me, that there was another congregation that did, and that was open to a liberating gospel. And so that was where I experienced my call to pastor. And so then went to Connecticut with Teddy and I. We were co-pastors there, and then he was still here working on his PhD, and our co-pastorate fell apart, our co-parenting fell apart, everything fell apart because he was here. And then, but while he was finding that the academy was really the best place for the expression of his gifts, I was finding that pastoring really was, and began to do some organizing work through Connect, and build relationships with, across faith traditions, which I hadn't done since I was in seminary, and coming together as a community. We were doing work on policing in Bridgeport, and that was where I felt like I could bring both of those things together. But he was here, and I was there. And so then when he got the position here, we decided to have our family together, and because when you're now and he wanted to be here, this is the best place, but as a woman pastor in the AME church, you're not going to get the same church. We had a larger church there, and so wanting to come here, I was assigned to a church that was smaller and was not able to, we weren't able to pay all the bills on that one salary for me. I mean, he had the other salary, and so I decided to work with GBIO, which was Connect's sister organization. And that's how I got here. And so I think it's beautiful, it's full circle, because the way in which God works initially, he was the pastor and I was a social justice person. Now I'm the pastor and he's the academic, and I feel very much that my pastorate is reflective of my passion for social justice as well, and that I am where I need to be.
So my experience was different because I came to seminary or to the School of Theology with almost 20 years of pastoral experience. Yeah. So I spent 10 years working with communities in South America, and then almost 10 years here when I came to the School of Theology. So for me, the turning point wasn't after seminary, was during seminary. And the best way for me to express what happened to me here is through this poem of Alvin Rich. It's called Invisibility in the Academy. Let me just read one verse, and then you understand why that was my turning point. When those who have the power to name and to socially construct reality choose not to see you or hear you, whether you are dark-skinned, old, disabled, female, you speak with a different accent or dialect than theirs. When someone with the authority of a teacher describe the world and you are knowing it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you look into a mirror and saw nothing. Yet you know you exist, another like you, that this is a game with mirrors. It takes some strength of soul, and not just individual strength, but collective understanding to resist this void, this non-being into which you are thrust, and to stand up, demanding to be seen and heard. So for me was, after working with all these communities, reading the literature in the field of spiritual studies and spiritual formation and practical theology in the Latino community, and say, where are my communities? I don't see those communities reflected here. And the reason is this. 80% of all Latinos, Latinas in the United States trace these roots to 3 places of origin: Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And most of the literature in theological studies, spiritual studies, in Latino studies, is produced by theologians from those communities. So what happened with the Guatemalans, the Salvadorians, the Nicaraguans, the Colombians, the Peruvians, is that our voices are not here there because the majority of what is produced by other communities. So I came with this phrase that I read about marginalization by exclusion or domestication by inclusion. I found how my communities and other communities were domesticated because they were included, but the voices were not heard. So for me, the issue of social justice here has to be with, not just with the voices of a community that doesn't have a voice because they have a voice. It's because it's like Dr. Goto said, I think a couple years ago, the work of a ventriloquist.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what I found in most of the literature about Latino spiritual studies and experience. It's the ventriloquist saying whatever they want to say, but know what is happening on the field. So I found this really important work it's another work of social justice because it's bringing the voices into conversation with the academy and with the church at large. And the other thing that I would say is that has been always this idea of, well, the academy is here, the church is here, and there's a big gap between the two. So you are a pastor, you go to the mean, you cannot really go into PhD because you are a pastor, and so this division between the two is another way of keep the structures going on.
Yeah.
When really the first theologians in the history of the church were pastors. So I see that gap all the time. When I think about foster care and adoption in this country, who began foster care and adoption in this country? The church. But now it's in the hands of the state because the church failed to fulfill the mission, because instead of doing service, ended up proselytizing. So I'm doing the same thing within the foster care community and the faith-based communities. Are we going to build those bridges between the two? So.
Well, it was a very interesting time for me, brothers and sisters, as I was approaching graduation. I thought about those unfortunate calls that may come once a month from Sally Mae that I wasn't looking forward to hearing. You know, Sally, kind of reminds me of that family member, that friend, that when you look at that number that calls, like, I know what this is about. So I wanted to avoid that, and desperately I did. So I began to consider some careers in a few different fields. I began to think about academics, but I didn't want to go into a 5 to 7 year PhD program because I wanted to be more where the suffering and the hurting, the dying, and the marginalized are. I thought I didn't want to necessarily become a full-time pastor because perhaps in some ways that would have limited the opportunity for me to be among the people, among the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the dispossessed full-time. Because let's face it, when you're a full-time pastor, you're juggling how to grow church membership, how to maintain church membership, and depending on the denomination, the building fund, raise the building fund, when's the door going to get fixed, when's the lights going to when's the light going to get fixed, and then all these questions from parishioners that might not necessarily reflect, for me, that might not necessarily reflect those that are at the bottom. I thought about other cities. I thought about going into organizing. I thought about organizing in LA and Chicago and Atlanta, and even applied for some positions in those respective cities, but those doors didn't open up. So I then began to focus in on Boston. I then began to think about the legacy here, the nonprofits here, to think about what organizations have to offer here. What do organizations have to offer here? So it was this moment that led me to originally go and work for Pine Street Inn, which is one of the biggest nonprofit that are dealing with homelessness in the state. I said, okay, and I started there on the outreach team. Started, on the night outreach where we would walk up where folks was, shooting up needles and, folks was getting high. We walk right up into the trenches and say, well, and at that time, and that department still does, where we offer sandwiches, blankets at that time. And for me, I applied for that position because I thought it would give me more of a hands-on experience of dealing with people who are impoverished in this city. Because I knew what poverty looked like in Philadelphia, and in some ways Boston doesn't have as quite the problem as Philadelphia, the urban problem, perhaps because poverty is more concentrated in Philadelphia because the population is a little bit larger and the problems abound. So, as I was approaching, graduation, I was just thinking I need to find a job. I did my internship with MCAN, Massachusetts Community Action Network, which is a part of the PICO network, which is the largest faith-based organization in the country. But to wrap this up, so I thought about, academics, I thought about pastoral, full-time pastoral, but, what appealed to me about, working with the homeless is this would give me a ground to understand the challenges that people who are homeless face. Yes, I could read about it, but until being in conversation with people who are in those positions, I would not gain that hands-on perspective. And eventually, for me, the goal is to move on to a position where it will allow me to help shape policy, public policy that affects the marginalized. But I wanted to start at somewhere where hearing stories, going directly to people, to people without a home, and just really just understanding how they got into the position that they got in, because there is a stigma around homelessness. We'll be honest about it, and through the work I've done so far, I've clearly seen that the intersection. The homelessness does not exist in a vacuum by itself. Oftentimes, it's the intersection between drug usage and undiagnosed mental health issues, and homelessness compounded with those two can make the process to recovery difficult for those who find themselves struggling with addiction. But so again, coming out of approaching graduation and would not, and I didn't want to hear those calls from Sally Mae. I needed to find a job, and and fortunately landed at Pine Street, and then things began to open up from there.
Well, I have a couple more questions, but I really want this to be a conversation, and I'm sure you guys have questions you want to ask. So I want to open up the floor now to any questions you have. You can get back to these if we need to, but I imagine you all have your own things you're wondering about hearing these stories. So, does anybody have a question they would like to ask? Yeah, Chris.
So I'm graduating in May, and I'm feeling that pressure of have to find a job, looking at the numbers, looking at cost of housing, looking at student loans. How do you balance, this is for everyone, how do you balance work that really needs to be done and work that is really important with living?
I think I'll just say for myself that it took some understanding that the first job is not going to be the dream job.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important to remind yourself that just because you're taking a job that's not your number one choice, it doesn't mean that that's not going to take you somewhere wonderful. Every place that I have been has built me into the person that I am today. And so I encourage you to look outside of the field if you need to find a job. I'll give you a couple of examples. So when I was at BU School of Theology, I also worked in marketing for Red Bull. I did like street promotions. I worked in restaurant industry. I, did all of that to survive while I was still trying to get to my primary mission. I think everybody can tell you the portfolio of various jobs that you do along the way, but you learn something from each of them. So I want to encourage people, look around, 360, right? Don't just look at where you want to go. Look at everything and everyone you know. Talk to everyone that you can about their ideas and opportunities. Look to see where the door is open. Go bringing what you have and do what you can, because that'll lead somewhere wonderful.
I will give you something that I have been just thinking the last couple of weeks. I began working with the church when I was a teenager, almost 40 years ago. And when I think about what happened in those days, I feel a calling in my heart. And after almost 25 years of ministry, the calling was kind of gone, and a job was there. And I feel really bad. But at the same time, I began working with this nonprofit because it was a job 10 years ago. Now the job is becoming a calling. And I cannot explain what happened. It's mysterious. So just trust, follow the calling to see it becomes a job, or follow the job to see it becomes a calling.
Thank you.
I also think we conflate a lot of things when it comes to seminary and life and job and career, particularly in a U.S. context. People say that there's a saying around like your job should it shouldn't feel like work. You know what? That is a very privileged mindset, and even the way that I'm going to speak for myself. Even the way I initially viewed my theological seminary call, it was very me, I kind of oriented, and it wasn't necessarily in conversation with how my vision about what I want to do, what does that mean in the world? Because that's that's what seminary is designed to do. Like, you're defining your own theological identity and how you're going to impact the world, but the reverse of how the world is going to impact you, that piece gets lost in a seminary education from my perspective. I can only speak from my experience. So for me, I think when it comes to work, I just think that maybe it's okay to kind of not be as sensational about that. Know that wherever the path leads, wherever God takes you, this is where that faith piece come into play. You know what the desires of your heart. And then there's all these systems that will either allow you to get there or block you along the way. It's really about having the faith to know, I gotta do what I gotta do between now until I'm able to get to the place that I wanna be, and not feel bad about it, not have shame about it, and really allow yourself I had to allow myself to detach from sometimes unhealthy God talk language that would block me from being able to just walk the journey to get me to the place where I knew I wanted to be. And for me, that was public life. I always knew I wanted to run for office, and I'm an elected official, and I still have to work another job, and I still do this clergy piece. So I know that I'm not even fully manifesting what I have in my head for the ministry that I want to implement and operate in the world. but you know what? One day at a time. And that's faith. So just be gentle with yourself. I know it's a long, long, long process, and just position yourself however you can to leverage opportunities when they come your way.
Is there another question?
It's very uncharacteristic of me. But okay, so I already work a job and I'm here full time and I'm exhausted. And then hearing about how you are cobbling together careers is also exhausting. And I'm not getting ordained, so I don't. I'm like nonprofit is my future. And how are you able to maintain energy? Like seriously, just like sleep enough, but also spiritual energy to keep doing this, because like the work that you all are involved in is also emotionally and like spiritually exhausting. So like how do you not just, I drink so much coffee, so I'm just like, how do you keep going? From already being depleted from your education.
So it's very difficult.
Okay, cool.
And for me, it starts with a commitment to self-care, which is easier said than done. But it looks like specific boundaries that I'm going to tell you what I have set out to do, which I don't always do. And when I don't do them, then I am more anxiety prone and, sleep deprived and angry and, lash out at my children. But what I do, so I work as a pastor, and I, at least in the Black church, there's no such thing in the AV church of really like a part-time pastor. They don't have a sense of really talking to people about what you will and what you won't do, or like only preach like, hi, you only paid me half time, maybe I should only preach 2 Sundays, a month. No, that's not the expectation there. So, but with the boundaries that I've set up, it's like, okay, I am working and I will be in Lynn 3 days. Or, well, actually, it started off 3 days, I had to move it to 2 because I needed a Sabbath in there. But so I'm on Sunday and Wednesday. You do not see me generally unless it's Wednesday and a Sunday, but I will have, I'll schedule at times other days, other evening events or something like that, but not regularly. And then with GBIO, so I have, over a workaholic pastoring, can do that. And then as an organizer, you have all these over workaholic, organizers. And I've said 3 days with GBIO, and they would prefer like, you can sort of cobble together a couple hours here, a couple hours there. You can do 27 hours, but that doesn't work for me. I need to be like, on this day, I'm thinking about GBIO stuff. I'm interacting with GBIO people. I'm not thinking about Lynn stuff. Now, it doesn't always work that way. But it was important for me to carve out the day. Now, though, when I started, because I had gotten good at having a Sabbath, but it took me 2 years, literally. I set the day, I said I'm gonna have it, I kept scheduling meetings, I kept doing things, and then it was like half a day, and then it was a couple hours, but then I got to the point where I was keeping it. And when I came here and I said, well, let me figure out how I'm going to do this part-time, because it's really 2/3 time, and it's 2/3 time, and that's more than a 1, and so I couldn't do it. And I was like, so I sacrificed the Sabbath, and I was miserable. And I said, no, I've got to do it. And so I did it. I said I was going to do it, but didn't schedule it. And then I scheduled it, but didn't keep it. And then it took me literally 3 months before the time I set it to the time I actually began to take it. And on that day, because this is Sabbath for me, I work out. And I will meditate longer than I will do it on other days. And a practice of meditation is actually something that has helped me a lot. And so those are sort of the very practical things that I have done. And still, I will admit that the life that I have put together with these 2 jobs and all of the pressures is not really sustainable for me in its current form. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out, how I can adjust. And really it starts with me, because I have a deep need to feel like I am competent and adequate and doing a lot, and I don't want to disappoint people. I don't want people to think that I can't do, and so it's very hard to say no. And to say no, what happens if I say no? Well, then people will be disappointed, and then people won't like me, and then getting to a point where like, oh well, right? God loves me. and I can't do everything. And the world will keep spinning. And other stuff will get done. And if it doesn't, maybe it wasn't that important. And that I had to meditate a long time to get to that point. And even now, it's something that rears its head. And I have a 6-week cycle, unfortunately, and I'll shut up. And that is, I get good at saying no, right? No, I can't preach there. No, I can't do that. No. And then, right, 4 or 5 weeks in, I'll like forget or something, and I'll agree to do something, and then I will get into this point where I'm overworked and I'm working, I'm not keeping my Sabbath, and I'm like, oh, why did I do that? I need to then say no, and then I've ended up disappointing somebody if I had just said no from the beginning as opposed to agreeing to it and then saying, this is too much. Later on, it would have been better. So I have like a 6-week cycle of doing that, but I've broken it because I've recognized, I look and say, it really is every 6 weeks part of it that you do this. And so really trying to maintain the boundaries, to set them and actively work toward them and to prioritize.
To address the first question, and then I can provide a little insight on what I do. What I did was like looked at LinkedIn, Indeed, Idealist, just for jobs that I thought I would be interested in. And I think part of having a degree from Boston University is that it's marketable. Even though theology is a specific focus, it does show some level of the individual, to employers, it does show some level of critical thought. One can engage in critical analysis because, master's degrees are just not given out. You wake up one day and it's an institution, BU doesn't roll like that. You can make it at BU, you can make it anywhere. And literally, at BU, you learn to be you, which the world needs, for folks to come alive, to be their authentic and genuine selves. To the second question, what I do is, because I'm not the senior pastor at Baraka, I don't have a lot of that weight falling on me, but at the Boston Rescue Mission, the staff is about 15 compared to Bridge Over Troubled Water where it's 80. So what happens with the rescue mission, when I first started, a little over a year ago, is, I would get these emails about how so-and-so, needs what we call in the field a homeless verification letter, proving that they're staying here. And if they were on my caseload, I needed to do it because I was the case manager. And they were in what we call the Safe and Healthy program. So there have been, in the beginning, there have been times when I went in, on off days to do these letters, or otherwise, clients' parole officers, would get on these clients.